for that were Countess Markovich, Helena Maloney and many others, women who would become more well known in the revolutionary movement. So these women are very active. They also set up a school in the north inner city, because again, if you look at what life was like for kids at the time, education was not a priority. Kids were sent out to work very young. For boys, going to work on the docks. For girls, going into domestic service or really lowly paid sort of factory work. So these women, a lot of them, they were either educating themselves or had access to third level education, because that had been opened up slightly to women. But this is the time of the cultural revival, the Gaelic League, so these women are educating themselves as well, and what they realised was that education is power, so try to pass that on to the younger generation. The Fianna Éireann was co-founded by a member of Nina, Countess Markovich. So she set it up with Bulmer Hobson in 1909 to counter Baden-Powell's Boy Scouts, who were young boys that would be then funneled into the British Army. Countess Markovich had a problem with this, and she believed that if young Irish boys were going to join an army, well then it should be an Irish army. Girls were not allowed to join the Fianna. There's only one slua, or one branch, that does include girls, and it's the Betsy Gray slua in Belfast. Countess Markovich thought boys were easier to manage than girls. So that's a crucial organisation, and you can see with the Fianna and Inina, those two organisations, the Fianna set up in 1909, that had 4 years on the Irish Volunteers. So then when the Volunteers is set up in 1913, you have the members of the Fianna have all that experience, training and drilling, and a lot of them become the first officers of the Irish Volunteers. So two organisations that go hand in hand. Now, moving on, we have the Irish Citizen Army, and then we have Cumann na mBan. So the Irish Citizen Army are basically, they were set up, born out of the 1913 lock-in, where you have the strikers that were being attacked by the police. So it literally is a citizens' army. Now, the difference with the Citizen Army and the Volunteers, which is set up roughly around the same time, November 1913, is that women could join the Irish Citizen Army. Women were not allowed to join the Irish Volunteers, that nationwide organisation set up initially to protect home rule. There were a few women that were members of the Irish Volunteers, one being Nellie Bushell. You have a handful of women, but predominantly women are not allowed in the Irish Volunteers. Citizen Army, different, women are members. So you find a lot of the women of Inina na hÉireann. With the Citizen Army, once that's set up, that is the organisation that ticks every box for them, so they sort of migrate over to the Citizen Army. Now, Cumann na mBan is set up in April 1914, because with the setting up of the Irish Volunteers, which was this nationwide organisation, it's decided that the women would go nationwide as well. Inina were based only in Dublin, so if you're in one place you can only do so much. So the women go nationwide, and Cumann na mBan, the Irish Women's Council, was set up in Wynn's Hotel. Now, generally, the way Cumann na mBan was set up, you have branches, and they would work alongside either a battalion of volunteers or a company. So what you have, before 1916, there are 4 branches of Cumann na mBan. So 3 of them operate on the north side of the city, 1 operates on the south side. So the ones on the north side are the Central branch, which was the biggest branch. You have the Fairview branch, and they would work alongside the 2nd Battalion of the Volunteers. The Central would work alongside the 1st and 2nd. And then you have the Columkill branch working primarily with the 1st Battalion of the Volunteers. However, the battalion that's on, or the branch that's on the south side, there's one branch, it's the Inina na hÉireann branch of Cumann na mBan. So Inina don't go away, they just become their own branch of Cumann na mBan. Yeah?
What does that word mean?
Inina na hÉireann, it's Daughters of Ireland. It translates to Daughters of Ireland,
Okay.
that name. and then coming on is the Irish Women's Council. So with Nina, they are the militant branch of Cumann. And the way the branches were set up, you'd have like a president, a treasurer, a secretary. In Nina are different because they have a commandant, a vice commandant, an adjutant. It's all on military lines. So when we come to 1916, the two militant groups of women are the Nina Naharan branch of Cumann, and then the women of the Irish Citizen Army. They knew how to use guns, they knew how to signal, as well as carry out first aid and all the other stuff they would have to do. Half of Nina were waiting for word to come from De Valera to go to Boland's. It didn't. So when the fighting starts, those women go to wherever they could. In all, 77 women were arrested and imprisoned after the Easter Rising. One was sentenced to death, and we'll talk about a few of them now. But there you can see the Marylebone Distillery, Jacobs, you have them in the College of Sword and Stephen's Green, Forecourt, GPO, and the outpost surrounding the GPO on O'Connell Street, all bar Boland's. So I'll tell you about just a few of them, because I can't tell you about all the 300 of them, we'll be here for days. But some of the more well-known figures. So Kathleen Lynn, a member of the Irish Citizen Army. And I suppose highlighting these women, it just also goes to show that they really had a vision of what the new Ireland would be, and these women continue to make a real difference in Irish life beyond the revolution. But she was a doctor, and she had trained the women in the use of first aid, as well as the members of the Citizen Army. She had a car, so on Easter Monday morning she's driving around bringing supplies. She ends up serving in City Hall in 1916. Now in City Hall you have Sean Connolly. He's a member of the Irish Citizen Army. About 9 women served in City Hall with Kathleen Lynn. Sean Connolly was killed early on in the fighting. His second in command, Sean O'Reilly, he was mortally wounded as well. Kathleen Lynn, together with Countess Markievicz, was one of 2 women that had been promoted to the rank of officer by James Connolly just a short time before the Easter Rising. Now, ideally, the City Hall garrison should have surrendered within a few hours of the rebellion beginning, but thanks to the quick thinking of the women, they held out for a little bit longer. Now, the women were told not to wear uniforms, so the women of Cumann had their uniforms, but they were told, because women were to be invisible in this, women were not combatants, they were first aiders, generally in war. But you have the British soldiers gaining entry into City Hall, and they met Ginny Shanahan, who was a member of the garrison, but they thought that she was a civilian who had been kidnapped. And the military asked her how many were in the building. She responded, hundreds. There was only about 30 in the building. They pulled back. They realised a while later there's not hundreds in that building, but the garrison hold out until Tuesday. Now, who leads them out when they do surrender was Kathleen Lynn, because she was next in line in rank. They were held in Ship Street Barracks, and then they were later brought to Richmond Barracks at the end of the rebellion. Now, going beyond 1916 and the revolution, she's one of 12 women that was deported after 1916, sort of living under house arrest in England. Didn't like that. She came back. While she's on the run, she sets up with Madeleine French Mullen and other women the first children's hospital in this country, St Ultan's, set up to deal with the huge problem of children being born with venereal diseases, with syphilis, as a result of the soldiers coming home. The government didn't care about these kids, but she did. All of the nurses that worked in St Ultan's, a lot of them had served with her in City Hall. She insisted y'all got qualified, and a lot of their daughters ended up working in St Ultan's. So there we have it, going beyond the revolution, really making a difference. Margaret Skinner, she served in the College of Surgeons and Stephen's Green. From Scotland, she was a member of the Devon branch coming on. She was requested, or came over from Scotland on her Easter holidays, smuggled detonators under her hat. She was the one that taught Countess Markievicz how to shoot a gun, but she actually leads an attack on a British military outpost in 1916. So Michael Mallon was War Commanding Officer. You had Stephen's Green Park surrounded because with the countermanding order, there just simply weren't enough volunteers to take over all the buildings and to hold them correctly and properly. So Stephen's Green Park, the leaves don't really protect you from bullets, so they had to remove themselves to the College of Surgeons, which was a fortress. But the British had set up positions in the buildings surrounding the park, including University Church. And she wanted to set fire to the nearby Russell Hotel so the fire would spread and then basically the soldiers had to leave. And she kept asking Mallon, he wouldn't let her, and then he gave up. And she led the attack. She wasn't part of it, she led the attack. So the small group, they get to Russell Hotel, that was at the corner of Harcourt Street. And so after trying to smash open the doors with their rifle guns, one of the guns was loaded and the gun went off. What they didn't know was that there were British soldiers in the building opposite who saw the flash of the rifle. They opened fire and she was shot 3 times in the back. Young Fred Ryan was killed, whether he was 18 years old. She's dragged back to the College of Surgeons and operated on without anaesthetic. And she did survive. Now again, going beyond the revolution, she went back to being a teacher, became president of the INTO, and campaigned for equal pay for unmarried male teachers and female teachers. Yeah.
Could I tell you that in 1946 I was a pupil in Kingston Street Secondary School and Margaret Skinner was my geography teacher.
No way.
We knew nothing about her history. She was just our geography teacher. If any of you remember an actress called Margaret Rutherford, she looked a bit like Margaret Rutherford, but she didn't teach us geography. She had a poem, How Did They Pass the Union? By perjury and fraud. And she had us do about the Act of the Union instead of geography. We didn't know who she was. There you are. 1946. And there you are.
Very softly spoken.
But she wasn't when she was at the Act of the Union.
So just to mention some of the other women that took part. So we've got Rose McNamara, and she was a member of the Nina Naharan branch, one of the 25 women that was in Marylebone Lane Distillery. Now these girls, they were so close to our friends, they were sisters, but we're very lucky in that we have a lot of accounts by the participants of the revolution, including a lot of women, either through the witness statements in military archives or the pensions. Her witness statement is fantastic. Food was a bit of an issue during Easter week. Jacob's Garrison were sick and tired of eating cakes and biscuits. You have the Marylebone Lane Garrison though being one of the best fed garrisons because they stole 2 calves, that were being brought back to a dairy in nearby Marylebone Lane, and they also stole 19 chickens, I think it was, that were their ways to White Regal Lodge. Bob Holland, who was a volunteer, was a butcher, so he did all what he had to do. But Rose McNamara talks about that they then had to serve this feast. But they hadn't got cutlery, so they were using bayonets to cut up the meat. Now, Marylebone Lane Garrison, they were there to protect the South Dublin Union. Now, there was a lot of intense fighting in and around what's now the Dry Canal, where the Lewis goes at Fatima. But then it eased off a bit. So much so that garrison are planning to have a Cayley on the Sunday, and Rose talks about washing our blouse and getting very just all excited for the Cayley, but of course the Cayley never happened because the surrender came on Sunday the 30th of April. Now, like all of the women in the garrisons, with the exception of the 3 that were with the headquarters garrison in Moore Street, the women were told, go, save yourselves. The women of the Marylebone Lane Garrison refused to leave. They were serving alongside their brothers, their friends, their neighbours, their sweethearts, and they wanted to share the same fate as the men. Now, one of the crucial roles that women played in the Rising, apart from feeding the garrison and doing first aid, was keeping up the morale of the men. And this is really shown with the women of the Union and the Heron branch, because when the garrisons surrendered, they are obviously deflated, they're demoralised, they don't know what's going to happen. But as they're being brought down the Coombe to surrender at Patrick Street, the fellows were throwing away the guns, the girls were picking up the guns. The Cooney sisters actually hid guns under their big skirts. The soldiers knew they had them, told them to get rid of them, they didn't. They brought them into Richmond's barracks and hid the guns in the chimney in the room that they were in. Now this shows the mentality of those women, because they thought that somehow when this was all over, they were going to get back into that barracks, into that room to retrieve those guns. So what that shows is that 1916, although military defeat, is a battle in the war that was to come. But there's a great sort of description of a scene that after the surrender, when they're at Patrick's Park and walking up Thomas Street, the men obviously are demoralised, and the women are singing at the top of their lungs, God Save Ireland. So it was really essential. That was another essential role that the women did play. Rose McNamara, one of the 77 women that was imprisoned in Kilmainham jail after 1916. And then it comes to the woman, the only woman that was sentenced to death after 1916, and that was Countess Markievicz. She was an officer, and there's debate as to whether she was second in command to Michael Mallon, but she was an officer in Stephen's Green, the College of Surgeons. And because of that role, she was sentenced to death, not executed, because she was a woman. The Germans had executed Nurse Cavell during the First World War, and obviously everyone came out against that. Imagine how it would look if then the British executed a woman. They couldn't hand that propaganda to the Germans. She was sentenced to life imprisonment, but because public opinion changed so quickly from one of anger against the volunteers into one of support for them, she was released with the remainder of those being sentenced in June 1917. With the women that weren't either sentenced to prison in England, it fell to those who were left behind to sort of rebuild the organisation and actually help change the minds of the people. One thing I will say about the Nina Nahair women and those women that were imprisoned in Kilmainham jail, they knew what was going on, as in the executions. They knew before the men what the gunshots they were hearing actually meant. The men were told was sniper fire, and the women were actually told we're executing your leaders. The British didn't know what to do with them, because again, women are not combatants. And you have again testimonies where basically the women were lined up and told, basically, if you promise to be good little girls, don't act like this again, we'll set you free. They said yes, and of course, as soon as they were released, they hit the ground running. This woman, Kathleen Clark, is the most important person after 1916, the widow of Tom Clark. Now, first signature of the proclamation. She wants to be with Tom in the GPO, despite the fact she had 3 kids, she was pregnant with their 4th. But Tom had a different job to her, which was to keep everything going. That's what she did. He gave her £3,000 worth of gold to set up a fund to help the families of those who would either be imprisoned or who would die, which she did, but 3,000 wasn't enough. So she sets up a fund. The Irish National, the Republican Dependence Fund, first later becomes the Irish National Aid and Volunteer Dependence Fund. Bit of a mouthful, but here are just some of the women. So the propaganda war begins with those women who had taken part in 1916, because the men were either dead or they were in prison. They couldn't change the minds of the people. These women, through that fund, were knocking on the doors, were collecting the money, were distributing the money. And again, that's an essential role that the women do play, because public opinion changed so quickly. By the end of December 1916, those who were interned in Frongoch, like Michael Collins and so on, they're released, come home as heroes, and then we have the bigger release, or the last release, in June 1917 of the likes of Countess Markievicz, Eamon de Valera, and so on. So, moving on, you have the volunteer movement, the Republican movement reorganising. Sinn Féin had nothing to do with 1916, it was the media, it was the government that labelled the rebellion a Sinn Féin rebellion. They were a moderate party, but they're taken over by the Republicans. There's a ready-made political party there for them, and they do that. They begin to put forward candidates in elections, but we have one very important event that helps to radicalise the people even more, and it is the conscription crisis of 1918. So, in the spring of 1918, the war was still raging. Britain desperately needed men for her army. Conscription hadn't been introduced to Ireland, so in their wisdom they decide, we can just conscript a load of Irish men, there'll be no response. The backlash was huge. You have everyone coming together, moderates, Republicans, and they all come together for this national campaign where you have men and women all over the country taking up the pledge that they will resist if Britain tries to introduce conscription. He talks about they couldn't even knock on the heat in the office, and used to wrap newsprints around their legs to try and keep themselves warm. The Irish Bulletin was so accurate that you had British politicians quoting it in Westminster. They didn't even trust the mainstream media. And throughout the War of Independence, no edition was not released. Even when the auxiliaries raided the offices and got a printer, the Republicans were one step ahead. They knew their machine had been seized, so they put out a special edition saying there's going to be a false one. This is what you should look for between, so you can tell how false stone is, and you can tell the difference between the real and the false one. It only stopped publication when the treaty signed in December 1921. Now, sort of making local connections, we have Gunners, Lucy Clement from the Reich, and then Eileen Bell, although Eileen not from Ballyfermot, her daughter Aileen lived in Ballyfermot, and Murray is her granddaughter. But Eileen, she was one of so many women that were providing arms deals. So it was reported by Eileen that she would often sleep, on the gun. There'd be a gun under the pillow, a gun under the bed. All around this country, you had women that were looking after weapons. They would get word that an ambush was going to happen. They would have to deliver the weapons. They would have to maintain the weapons. They would have to clean the weapons. And then obviously gather them after an ambush had taken place. She worked in Dublin Castle. She was actually identifying the potential targets. So basically with Bloody Sunday, you have British agents being sent over to Ireland to destroy the IRA. They got close to Collins, and he decides he would strike first. Now these men were invisible. They were not taking or sort of working in military barracks or police stations. They were operating at night. They were businessmen, so they didn't know where they were. Michael Collins, the film, which is a bit light on the truth, but Rosie, if you've seen the film Michael Collins, Rosie, there was a Rosie. So there was a maid who actually gave the names to Charlie Dalton. She was working in one of the addresses. But Lily Merlin, she also gathered information, got addresses of men that were going to be targeted. She would go to whist drives in Dublin Castle. The auxiliaries would ask her out. She didn't want to go by herself, so she brought a friend, and she would get the information, and then she'd meet with Frank Sora, one of Collins' agents, Collins' men, and she'd identify the fellas, the targets. The authorities after Bloody Sunday, when you have not the British intelligence being wiped out, but it was severely hampered, the authorities realised there was a spy in the castle, didn't suspect Lily Merlin, and promoted her. She got even closer to the information after Bloody Sunday. After it was all over though, and she talks about this in her pension file, I don't know if she and the other women who took part in this event whether they realised the information that they were passing on, what was actually going to be done with it, but she did have a nervous breakdown after it was all over. Collins looked after her, got her help, and she did recover. But that was the impact of doing the things that they were doing. Molly O'Reilly, she'd been out in 1916, and she was in City Hall. She worked in the Bon Bouche restaurant, she worked in the United Services Club, which is where the British officers used to go, and she'd listen in on the conversations. Now when it was getting a bit hot, she moved from the United Services Club, which is on Stephen's Green, around to Bon Bouche on Dawson Street. where the British officers would place their guns in the basement. She would send word to the IRA, there's guns here, they drop down, they get the guns, and then they were off. So here we have just 2 women. There were a whole host of women that were involved in Bloody Sunday, but that's just 2 of them. Now I do love this photograph. This is May Burke, Ethna Coyle and Linda Cairns. This is taken during the truce, so when War of Independence was over. And the story behind it is Linda Cairns here, again, a woman who had a car in Ireland. So she was based in Mayo, and she would work with the local IRA to transport weapons and men. And she was with a few members of the local IRA. One night they're stopped by a patrol of auxiliaries, the car is full of guns, and she takes responsibility because at this stage, late in the War of Independence, the British had brought it in that if you were found with a gun, you could be executed. So she took responsibility. They were all put on trial. The men were sentenced to imprisonment rather than death, and so too was she, sent to prison in England. She went on hunger strike because, as she saw it, her crime had been committed in Ireland. She could serve her sentence in Ireland. So the authorities relent and they transfer her from England to Mountjoy. Now, she's told by the governor, she's welcomed, and she's told that everything will be okay if she promises not to try to escape. Linda says she won't try to escape, and this photograph is taken after she, May Burke and Ethna Coyle escaped from the jail. But look at the photograph. If ever there was a big 2 fingers up to the establishment, now I don't know if this was ever printed, I doubt if it was at the time, but they're standing on the Union Jack, and they are armed. Now there's a couple of these photographs and they're posing like soldiers, but it is a powerful, powerful, powerful photograph. The truce obviously brought an end to fighting, and then negotiations take place between the British and Irish governments. Michael Collins and Arthur Griffith and delegation go over to London to negotiate the treaty. The country had been partitioned before. The treaty was signed in December 1921, obviously doesn't give the Republic that they had fought for. But as I said, partition had already been set up in December 1920, so it's the oath that Irish politicians will have to take to the British monarch. That really is the thing that people cannot accept. At this time, we had 6 women TDs in the Dáil. We had Countess Markievicz, Kathleen Clark, Kate O'Callaghan, Mrs Pearson, mother of Patrick and William, Dr Ada English and Mary McSweeney. All of the women TDs rejected the treaty. The debates are all online. They are fantastic to read, very emotional. But the women were seen to be inciting the sort of emotions that were going on. It was said they rattled the bones of the dead. Everyone was emotional in the treaty debates. She was looking for her sweetheart, Dick McKay, who was in Jacob's biscuit factory in 1916, but she wasn't making her way across the city with bullets whizzing around, so she actually serves in the GPO. Wasn't a member of Cumann na Món at the time, but joins Cumann na Món after 1916. Dick McKay was her sweetheart, and he, together with Paddock Clancy and Conor Clune, were murdered in Dublin Castle after the morning's events on Bloody Sunday. She later got married and she changed her name to Maura O'Neill. Now, if you've been to the National Museum, you may have seen the Roll of Honour. It's online for those people who served in 1916. And she originally put her name down as Maura O'Neill, but she wants to change it to who she was in 1916, May Gibney. Went down to the museum and she met the curator there. Now, the connection between her and Essie Snoddy is that they had shared a cell in Kilmainham jail during the Civil War, had both been anti-treaty. Essie was the younger of the two, so Maura O'Neill or May Gibney takes her under her wing. But after the Civil War was over, they lost contact and both thought each other dead. So May Gibney is talking to the curator and she asked his name, and he said Snoddy, and she said, I once knew a person, a woman called Snoddy, but she's a long time dead. He asked her the name, and he said, no, he said, she's very much alive, and that's my mother. And this is the photo of their reunion, possibly 30, 40 years after they had last seen each other. And what this photograph shows is that the revolution was part of their life. They were women before the revolution, they were women during it, and they certainly were women after it. And although they were excluded from big politics for a long, long time, as we've seen with Kathleen Lynn, with Margaret Skinner, with so many others, that these women did actually make a huge difference on the ground where it mattered, in both their local communities and beyond. Thank you.
These are fibre photographs. Come on.
Charlie, get in there.
No, we're all right.
Come on, get in there at the end of the fight. I want to find the photograph. Get in there.
Troublemaker. Troublemaker.
No, keep your hands quiet. Keep your hands quiet.
I didn't know.